As preachers and teachers, we have been especially concentrating upon explaining the biblical truths to listeners in our church and in our classroom. But have we ever considered this special question? What will our listeners be expected to remember all that we say? I want to continue explaining briefly the contents of my soon-to-be published book on unforgettable preaching and teaching. Our journey focuses on 3 memory systems in the brain that God created for us and how they can be used to help listeners remember what they hear in your sermons or class presentations. These memory systems store up for us 3 kinds of knowledge: head knowledge, heart knowledge, and living knowledge. When we learn and understand and remember a truth that comes from the Bible, we obtain what I call head knowledge. My next video program after this one will explain heart knowledge. That knowledge is what you have absorbed and come to believe in our faith. And the last video program explains living knowledge, our memory of truths that come from the Bible and that guide us in our life. In this particular video, I want to concentrate on the way to develop head knowledge. That is, the biblical truths that you want to have stick in your listeners' long-term memory. Head knowledge includes the biblical truths that you, the preacher or teacher, want to help your listeners learn, understand, and remember. This is what we do as we communicate biblical truths to the brain of our listeners. We're attempting to secure that biblical memory, that biblical truth, I should say here, in the person's memory, technically called semantic memory. Semantic memory contains knowledge, what the listener has learned and understood, factual data, even beliefs like the earth is round, and that 50,000 word vocabulary of the average high school graduate. But it also contains biblical truths like Jesus is God and God forgives all sins through Christ. Learning about this memory system can help you appreciate the process of learning and understanding what hopefully happens in the listener's brain. After all, of course, not everything is learned nor understood. Let me help you understand this process. The brain that God created for us contains a lot of what are called neurons, those vertical black strings of tissue, really only about a half-inch long and less than hair width. Now, there are a lot of them, 186 billion. Yes, I said 186 billion, all in this magnificent 3-pound structure on top of our shoulders. Look now at those vertical black strings. They are called neurons. But there's more to the neurons that makes them still more complicated and productive. Let's look at an individual neuron, the one on the left, for example, and a simple network of 2 of them together, the left and the right. Each has branches attached to it, 5 to 10,000 of them, called dendrites. And each neuron also has a core called its axon. Now, what you are essentially trying to do in preaching and teaching is to help your listener attach one of those dendrites to the axon or core of another neuron. The attachment occurs through an electrochemical discharge. That constitutes, yes it does, what we call learning, as your listener learns and understands the biblical truth that you are explaining. As I explained in the first video, I've learned that each of us, and this includes your listener too, has developed certain strategies or ways that help us make a lot of those electrochemical discharges, and they all help us learn, understand, and remember what is told us. Now, if you use these strategies deliberately and consciously, you can help your listener secure that biblical truth in his or her memory system. Remember though, it doesn't happen automatically. You need to help it along. Effective preachers and teachers have already instinctively been managing this for years. You can use now each of the 4 strategies that we found and see that they help us gain head knowledge. They help the learning process in your listener's brain. But wait, God didn't create an omniscient and omnipotent brain for us. Our brain and your listener's brain, they all have definite limits. Of all the sensations that come from the outside, look on the right-hand side of the screen and the right side of the skull. All the sensations that enter from that outside and then enter our brain. From all of those, we just can't remember everything. Thus we have just 3 of those in the screen showing and ending up in the brain itself. We just can't remember everything you say in your sermon. Notice though that of all the sensations coming into the brain from the outside, only certain ones then are finally admitted. Those that the brain, and this is important, those that the person's brain believes are most important. Now, we have another specialized memory system in the brain. It's called our working memory, and it's used to deal with all the information received in a current 1 or 2 hour period, such as the 10-minute section of this particular video. It's called our working memory. I've been talking before only about our long-term memory systems. This working memory is a special one. Think of all the ideas that you share with your listeners in your sermon. They can't hold all of these ideas in their working memory. At the most, listeners can keep only about 3 or 4 ideas at one time in their working memory. Of those 3 or 4 ideas that are retained in the working memory, well, at the end of the sermon or class hour, listeners may transfer only 1 or 2. That's amazing now, and think of it that way too. You transfer only 1 or 2 to their long-term semantic memory. Of course, students in the classroom have the benefit of recording some of the ideas in a journal or notebook. But without that notebook, they too would retain only 1 or 2 of the ideas that you have given them. This is now what some homileticians have been telling us over the years. From their experience, they report that hearers say that sermons just contain too many ideas to remember. Well, what can you do about this? Well, think of the people in your church's pews asking this question in their mind: what should I remember of all that I hear? Keep that question in mind as you prepare your sermon or class presentation. For my study of the brain, I would emphasize what we find here as 2 different strategies. In preparing a sermon or class presentation, you ordinarily start with a main idea. This is what homileticians have been telling us too. And then you should develop a single theme. But you need, listen to this, you need a simple and a single intriguing theme, one that will stick. Keep in mind that very little will eventually get into your listener's long-term memory, but the single intriguing theme will. Homiletians have noticed that many preachers do not use a single theme, but rather just a general idea. In my experience, it's been true for me too in many of the sermons that I hear Sunday after Sunday. Unfortunately, I do not have time to give you examples and other hints of the kind of theme you should develop. You can find them in the book that I hope to publish. Nor can I here and now share with you the other strategies besides the two I have named so far. One stresses the importance of explaining your single theme according to an outline. Now that's not a simple procedure, but it's a very necessary one to follow with its specific strategies. And there is finally another strategy, reinforcing the theme so that it will definitely be the one thing remembered from your sermon. Both of these are extremely important, and they're also needed to make your sermon unforgettable. They are explained in greater detail in the book. This is now only the first part of what you need along your road to unforgettable preaching and teaching. It's the strategies that lead to head knowledge. In the next video, I will share with you briefly the strategies that can lead to remembered heart knowledge.